we were there with like 120 other bass players, and we were, I don't know, somewhere in the 60s or 70s, and no one had advanced yet. And I just remember that feeling of walking out onto the stage in a big hall, because quite frankly, having not taken another professional audition yet, that's a whole new experience. I got nervous and I was shaking here or there. It didn't go well, but it was certainly my first experience. And what's funny was afterwards, Ira had I can't remember how he played or whatever, but he, neither one of us had advanced at that time. And we were just looking at each other like, I don't really understand this. How could we not have moved on? You and I are both good players. What's going on? And so he's sitting in the car trying to piece this all together.
I had such a great time visiting Dallas this month, and I'm so excited to bring you today's conversation with Brian Perry. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations. We are 400 episodes and going strong here, and I can't believe this is the first time I've chatted with Brian Perry. What a fantastic time I had hanging out in Texas and getting to know Brian and spend time with him, and just what an inspiring guy and what a great journey he's had. Brian is a member of the Dallas Symphony, the most recent member of the double bass section for the Dallas Symphony. He teaches at Southern Methodist University. He's a past member of the Fort Worth Symphony, studied with Ed Barker at Boston University and Jeff Bradetich at North Texas. And we get into all this and so much more. For the first part of this episode, we dig into the difference that one teacher can make. Brian's time with Larry Moore, then Jeff Bradetich, then Ed Barker, and the experience of meeting Ed Barker for the first time. Great story. And also Ed's whole diction on the bass demonstration. Part 2 digs into auditioning, and Part 3 is all about staying motivated. And we're going to kick off this episode with a recording of Brian playing the Brahms E minor sonata. Dad was in television?
Yeah, he still works in television. He may be retiring next year, but he works for the public broadcasting company up in OETA, which is sort of like our KERA here in Dallas. And he works in television. He produces documentaries for the local public television affiliate up there.
Really?
Yeah, and so he's been in television all my life. I mean, we kind of moved around. We lived in Florida. We've lived in Tennessee. We lived in Oklahoma. But once we moved to Oklahoma is where he settled into a state. Up there, it's a state job. So he basically is, his salary comes from the state, but it's they still do publicly funded television. And so he's been focused mostly on state issues and the arts, and he's won several regional Emmy Awards for his programming that he's produced. And so I've been around television kinds of things most of my life, in that way. And perhaps even though they aren't musicians, I didn't grow up around musicians. I think, especially from my dad's point of view, he's always been sort of like a performer and being in front of cameras and things. Maybe that is a bit of what got me headed in this direction on some sense.
When did they get you going in music?
I got started in the 4th grade. I guess some musicians in the public school system started in the 4th grade, and they had like this weird hand chart. The orchestra came to my school in 3rd grade. I guess it was a middle school orchestra. They basically had this very strange hand chart that showed hand shapes or whatever, and my hands seemed to line up. It's so ridiculous now thinking about it. My hands seemed to line up with like the shape of the hand for the bass. I don't even know where they got this information. But as soon as I brought it home and told my parents that I think it's going to work for me to play the bass, there was a little bit of a panic, knowing that it was a larger instrument. The good news was we were already in like our second minivan at this point, so that was just able to continue, And so I actually started with they didn't have a small enough size bass at the time for me to use, so I started with a cello with bass strings on it, and that was in 4th grade. And I kind of I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the fellowship of the orchestra, being in that, but I didn't really get serious about lessons until I got to high school. And that's when I encountered a sort of Mr. Holland kind of person. Larry Moore, who was a bassist in the Oklahoma City Philharmonic and was going to become my music director in high school, or the orchestra director in high school, was a bassist, and he sort of encouraged me and started pulling me aside saying, we should do some private lessons, just on the side, like you and I should just start working together, because I really think that, you can cultivate some talent. And it came at a time when I was getting more and more serious with some other friends who were siblings and in a quartet, the Igo sisters. I mean, there was like an older sister who was a cellist, and then twins who played violin and viola. And I saw them as colleagues who were just around playing together and having a great time and taking things very seriously. And so I immediately linked up, became good friends with them, and then that coupled with Larry being there and taking things more seriously, I just kind of got hooked in. And I went from, getting nowhere in all-state auditions my freshman year because I didn't spend any good amount of time practicing, to being I guess that would have been my sophomore year, to being like principal of the all-state junior and senior year. And so it was this realization that if you put the work in, that all of a sudden that could really take you somewhere. And also just that Larry was showing me things that rather than playing, Route 5 on everything, he would, we'd be working on Capuzzi Concerto. And I had no idea that repertoire existed for my instrument. Not now I know there's so much more than that, but I'm just saying, that was the first inkling I had that there was more to it than just what we do in the school orchestra. One of the things he immediately did with the Putnam City North High School Orchestra was he established some before-school rehearsals with full orchestra. He wanted to integrate this band program and the string program to have full orchestra. And so we would meet at 7 a.m. for rehearsals, which is mind-boggling to me now, to think of playing that early. But that was so we could do a Beethoven symphony or something like that. He wanted us to get to know these greater works and develop a passion for that kind of music.
And you went to University of North Texas. You've known Jeff Bradetich for a long time. You're on the board for the Bradetich Foundation.
Right.
When did you first meet Jeff Bradetich?
So that came about, I first met him in 1996. I did his summer master class, and that was shortly after he had come to North Texas. He was, I want to say he came down to North Texas in 95, something like that. I remember first getting a postcard in my mailbox from his master class advertising it, him smiling with a bass on his shoulder. I couldn't believe it. Anyway, so it was actually Larry Moore. He's like, look, this guy Jeff Bradetich, this incredible pedagogue and player, is coming down to North Texas. You should really consider going down and auditioning or going down to this master class. It's so close by. It'd be worth your while. And Larry never even thought twice about anything he could do to help me develop. He drove me to Indiana. This is my high school orchestra teacher, drove me all the way to Indiana to play for Larry Hurst and all the way back home. I mean, the dedication he had for wanting me to feel as though this was something I could do was really immense. And so I came down to Jeff's master class in 96, and that was my first exposure to him, and then that was between my junior and senior year of high school. And so then I followed up with doing it the next year. So it was a pretty packed summer in 97 of having committed to going to North Texas, but also going to Jeff's masterclass following the Houston Bass Convention. And so all of that coupled together, the inspiration at that particular convention, which sort of really took me over the edge as far as wanting to be serious about things, I think that really made a huge impact that summer. So I got to know Jeff through both of his master classes, basically, and then from there on out, I was at North Texas for basically 5 years, 4.5 for all the coursework, and busy with summer festivals in the summertime.
What was that experience like for you, that very first master class with him?
Well, I had not been around someone who was teaching me yet quite how to make the bass sing like that, His artistry is something that just sort of goes beyond bass playing. I mean, up to that point, my teacher, who I was very fortunate, Larry being someone who plays the bass extremely well and is just a fabulous educator, set me up well technically going into that. But Jeff really took it a step further as far as helping me think more about how to sing on the instrument. And he's known for that kind of sound that he's able to produce. Being surrounded, mostly by that many bass players in one place that were that good and being able to work together that way just really impressed me. I mean, he had great control over a room full of like 30, 40 people, especially when we're all doing those exercises in the morning, and it's quite an impressive sound, and also just to feel like as a kid from Oklahoma that there were other kids from all over the place. That was my first exposure to sort of, students from all over the country, but all over the world coming to work with him. And it was just a really cool experience to feel like there were other people doing what I wanted to do and maybe validating in some ways,
When did you first meet Ed Barker?
So I first met him at one of the Texas Bass Symposiums. Now, one of the cool things about the state of Texas is how many incredible schools we have here in the state of Texas for educating bass players. I mean, we've got Rice, we've got Baylor, we've got North Texas. I'm trying to get something going now at SMU, Texas Tech, TCU. We used to come together once a year, all of the schools, and we would whoever was hosting, it would be like a miniature convention. So there would be like master classes by the teachers, but there would usually be a guest artist of some kind. And I want to say it was like 1998 or 99 when it was hosted at Baylor. And Chris Butto was the teacher at the time, and his guest artist was Ed Barker. And I had heard about him, being the principal bass of the Boston Symphony, but I hadn't really heard him, I mean, it's amazing now with YouTube and whatever, you can just go hear whoever you want. But at the time, I had not heard him play, and so he came down, and I want to say, he gave a master class. But the biggest thing that he did was he gave this whole like lecture demonstration on diction on the bass. Yeah. Blew my mind. And not only did he do the lecture on Jeff Bradetich's bass, one that he had basically gotten a couple hours before and was able to just demonstrate everything and make the bass do exactly what he wanted to do. This was someone who had thoroughly analyzed and intellectualized all of this stuff, was able to transmit the information verbally, but most importantly, sit down and do exactly what he just said. And I've found that that's one of the most amazing things about him, is that he's an incredible teacher, highly detailed, extremely sophisticated in his analysis of how to do things, but is also able to sit down and still do all those things. I just really admire that. I hope that I can still do that sort of stuff too, be able to do, because sometimes people make better teachers or make better players, and those things don't always go hand in hand. But I think with him, I mean, he's doing it no differently than he would have 30, 40 years ago, and many of my colleagues who've worked with him, or many of those around him, feel like he could totally win his job all over again if he had to.
Right.
And that's just a really impressive thing.
The concept of diction on the bass, and I had Ed on the podcast, and he talked through his, that, which is totally fascinating. Even better if you can see him do it in person, of course. But like, what is diction on the bass? A lot of people probably wouldn't even think to apply that word to bass playing.
Well, basically, I mean, it's a concept of breaking down the various ways you can articulate sounds on the instrument, but doing it in such a way that you sort of make a parallel connection to human speech, because that's something we all seem to be able to grasp. I'm often telling my students, why don't you do that phrase over again? And this time I want you to pretend like you're an actor on a stage trying to say some sort of Shakespearean line to the person at the very back of the room. And I immediately grasped onto this topic because my again, maybe going back to hearing my dad, who used to do, whether it be voiceover work or whatever he's doing, or learning how to articulate on television or whatever it was. I mean, he was a sports reporter at one point, so he knows how to talk in such a way. So this is something that I immediately latched onto. But it's the concept that, the way you speak and the way you enunciate as a performer, we have to translate that on our instrument. You have to really clearly project what it is you're trying to say. Otherwise, everything just kind of gets washed out and lost. And you may feel like you're making a crescendo there, or you may feel like you're playing that note very short and precise. But if you're not telling the person at the back of the room that that's happening, then it may not come across that way. And so I try to instill that in my students. That's something that stuck with me. When I would work with him I found that I felt like I could play Brahms too, but not at that level of detail, you know what I mean? And so there was a lot to work on there, and my technique, that was what was the beauty of, working with Jeff first. I came in, I remember playing for Ed. It was I wasn't able to make the audition day because I was playing a half season of the Dallas Opera. And this was after my senior year. And so I worked out a time to go play for Ed at his house in January. And, some guy from Texas trying to go play for someone in Boston in January just didn't even cross my mind.
Right. Yeah,
He's like,
exactly.
Just come on over. I live 40 miles outside of Boston. Just come on over. So anyway, I'm driving out there. Huge, enormous, big, fat snowflakes. These winding, woodsy lanes without any street lights. I'm like, this is crazy. But no, it was a great 2 hours. I mean, he went well over what he needed to go over because I think he sensed that we would work well together. And I was just immediately floored by the level of detail we got into right off the bat. And I knew it was going to be the right place for me. It's kind of like the way I imagine, the way I experienced Boston being this highly intellectual city, with all of these universities in one small area. You just feel this buzz. I'm sure San Francisco is a little bit like this, where it just feels like there's a lot of incredibly smart, intelligent people thinking around you all the time. And that completely translates not only to Ed and the style, but that's the way that bass section is in Boston. It was great that I got a chance to join them on stage at Tanglewood this summer too, and that happens from time to time. And I'm just always reminded of how every single one of those players is thinking about what they're doing in a way that is highly artistic, and they're not just back there cruising. They're always thinking. They always have something to say. I could get something out of each one of them if I asked them. It's just a really special place to be around enthusiastic, motivated bass players like that.
There's such power in that cohort that you're going through with, and you learn so much from your colleagues, as much or more so than even these great teachers. And you had that at North Texas too.
Exactly.
Certainly, this large bass program.
That's actually a very important component. I actually try to tell all of the students that I work with, it can be a lot about the teacher, and you should find a teacher that works with, but really ask the important questions. What's your studio going to be like next year? How many are you going to have coming in? Will I have access to these people? Because that was what a huge decision, like when I auditioned for Ed, one of my possibilities was to attend NEC or BU. He was willing to work with me at either place, but NEC I was going to be his only student. And at BU, I was going to be coming in with 3 or 4 other people. And I had learned that being around the bass studio at North Texas, that's a really important component to be able to take the ideas that your teachers give and to go downstairs and just bounce them off the walls with each other. I learned so much from those around me and the strengths that they were taking from Ed. I mean, I felt like I was getting some feedback from Ed just through them. And so I think it's an important lesson for anybody who's pursuing college studies with any teacher is to sort of find out what the studio environment is like, because that is a really critical thing. We've seen down at Rice and the way Paul Ellison has also fostered that sort of cohesive environment. It's really important, I think, for anybody who's considering that. And they shouldn't just look for the teacher, It's the studio environment that makes really a lot of importance. You're going to be there for 4 years or however long you are. You want it to be a good group of people.
Next up, we dig into the topic of auditioning, a big topic for sure. We talk about Brian's whole audition journey, what knocks people out of the first round, the audition club, Cake Club, we'll get into that. Very cool story there. Pushing out the sides of the box so that you can really do what you're called upon to do more comfortably. How tempo's the icing on the cake. So many great takeaways. And before we dive in, I want to give a shout out to, a new sponsor. So glad to have the Chromatic N Pin on board. Emilio Guarino's Chromatic N Pin. And you got to go check out the website, folks, thechromatiCnpin.com. You'll see up there, unless Emilio's reading the website, it says, "The bass is just too easy to play, said no one ever." And it's all about this N Pin, which I have been using. I've got it on my practice stand right now, and I'm really digging this bent N Pin, adjustable N Pin, adjustable in all different kinds of angles. This is a concept that's much easier to see than for me to describe, so just go check it out. And when you go check it out, you'll see a video that I shot of me demoing this N Pin along with several other people, showing what this N Pin is doing for them and more about just what an angled N Pin can do for you in general. So it's a great site just to learn more about different ways to hold the bass, posture, concepts, and how making adjustments in the N Pin world can help. Thanks for sponsoring the podcast, Emilio. The Chromatic N Pin, very cool new offering from Emilio. Definitely check it out. And thank you also to Upton Bass. They make the only bass commercially made that Gary Carr endorses, the Carr model. And this bass was the 2009 silver medal winner in tone, played obviously by Gary Carr, but also many other prominent owners like David Murray, past podcast guest. There's a great video of him demoing that, and Craig Butterfield, and many others. Great to have Upton on board, and thanks for sponsoring the show. And also, big shout out to Bass Violin Shop, a longtime sponsor at this point. Bass Violin Shop, they offer sales, appraisals of new and used double basses. They have the largest inventory in the Southeast for basses. It's carved basses, it's hybrid basses. That's from entry-level student basses all the way up to fine pedigree instruments. So check them out at bassviolinshop.com. Okay, now we dig into auditioning with Brian Perry, and we're going to feature an excerpt from Upon a Wheel of a Cloud by Mark Berger. And this is a trio for viola, cello, and double bass. It's from the BUTI faculty concert back in 2011. And Mark's the violist in the Lydian String Quartet and also teaches viola and composition at Brandeis University. He's a friend of Brian, and he's a BUTI faculty member. Enjoy this and our conversation on auditioning.
I don't even remember. I think it was Nina DeCesar. I can't remember exactly, but somebody saying that they decided at a certain point, we the bass students, we want to get together more frequently. We're going to get together and purposely play for each other and go through, and that just such an incredibly important part of the learning component, whether it's for, just getting better in general or preparing for auditions. Yeah. And we're sitting here, you've won 2 major auditions, 2 of the United States best jobs, and also got into the New World Symphony. These great. So you edit Hot Shots, right, in the ISB Bass World Journal.
In the Zone, we call it now.
In the Zone. That's right. Is that what it's called? Okay,
it moved over. Yeah.
Okay. In this, so you've thought a lot about auditions. You've been through that whole process yourself. Mm-hmm. Talk about your first experiences auditioning, maybe your first professional audition, and just what that early journey was like for you.
It's actually a very interesting story. Ira Gold and I took an audition at the same time for Baltimore Symphony, and we rode down from Boston together in the car. We're crazy enough, I think, to stop by David Gage's shop on our way down because we were just like,
why not?
Why not? We're just on our road to an audition. But yeah, we made our way down to Baltimore, and I think it was one of Ira's first audition experiences as well, for a professional level orchestra, and it was just a really interesting trip. I mean, it was a very eye-opening thing. I look back on it now, I think I had no idea what I was doing, But yeah, we were there with like 120 other bass players, and we were, I don't know, somewhere in the 60s or 70s, and no one had advanced yet. And I just remember that feeling of walking out onto the stage in a big hall, because quite frankly, having not taken another professional audition yet, that's a whole new experience. It's one thing to prepare for things in smaller or recital hall type environments, playing for people here or there. It's another thing to walk out, you hear that door close. It's almost like a vacuum seal. You go outside, and then there's just this silence.
The chamber of judgment.
The chamber of judgment. And, there was that real feeling that's so hard to replicate of, oh my gosh, this is about to happen, and I have to execute now. And I remember this really heavy, at least it looked heavy to my audition eyes, this really heavy curtain in front of me that just was like neon sound, like in neon words, like sound soaker, just soak it all up. It felt like it was leather or something. And I just remember feeling that, wow, this is a really naked experience. So I got nervous, and I was shaking here or there. It didn't go well, but it was certainly my first experience. And what's funny was afterwards, Ira had I can't remember how he played or whatever, but we both, neither one of us had advanced at that time, and we were just looking at each other like, I don't really understand this. How could we not have moved on? You and I are both good players. What's going on? And so he's sitting in the car trying to piece this all together. Meanwhile, I had determined on this trip afterwards that this is when I was going to ask my in-laws to marry my wife.
Oh, no, you had other thoughts on your mind.
I was past this. I was already done. The audition was behind me 5 minutes ago, and so I was headed for me, which was the real test, to see if that was going to work out. On my way down to Baltimore, where we were not far from where my in-laws were in Virginia, so that's where I was headed. And so that was my first audition experience. Yeah. And, of course, Ira went on pretty quickly to recover from that and do very well after that, both in San Francisco and eventually Detroit, and then National, where he is now. And so we've remained great friends since and teach at BUTI. But, yeah, not long after that was the next one in Fort Worth. And I think I might have done a Boston audition before that, and then Fort Worth ended up working out. And so that was a quick sequence of events from the New World possibility to Fort Worth, and where I wound up.
Well, if we take that Baltimore audition and go to the committee perspective, okay? Because it's so many of us, me included, you had that experience with Ira getting boinked out of the first round and thinking like, what happened? Take us on the other side of that screen. Like, what are you listening for when you're back behind that screen? What's going on in a situation like that? I look around at these 6 other bass players in my round, and like, none of us advanced, really?
Right. Yeah.
Like, what's it like behind that screen when you're actually listening to folks?
It's tough. I mean, I feel like there's a different kind of listening that happens in different rounds, And this is something that, between listening to the players even at the Bradetich competition last week, and listening to auditions fairly recently, particularly for bass, that I've come to realize is, those early rounds are a lot about building some consistency. If someone is playing something that's very consistent, they put together, I like to think of it as different flavors amongst all the composers. Something where they pick up on the stylistic differences, and they play that way. Getting out of the first round is a lot about just having nothing to argue about. Okay. So, you go in, you're solid, you play things well, and there's not a lot of argument going on. When you get into the semifinals, I think what happens there is at least I like to listen for the musician. I tend to feel like an occasional blip or a mistake's going to happen, but I will not be so hung up on that if I'm hearing the music that's going on through the excerpts that are being played or the solos being played, because I feel like who we're wanting to hire is the best musician on the stage, and we're tasked with putting forward the musicians to the music director to pick from, and there's no doubt that they're going to be listening for the best musician on the stage. So I find that, I certainly have never played a flawless audition. And I think that if you can keep in mind the larger picture of being able to present something that is going to woo not only the bass players, but maybe more importantly the violinists and the violists and the cellists, what are they going to be listening for? Many times they're not as familiar with the ins and outs of the details that we obsess over as bass players. We've become so familiar with the repertoire, and that's just, to get you to bass line, right? But you're often tasked with trying to win over those kinds of people, and they're listening to phrasing, they're listening to how their part fits in, so you want to be very aware of, we dive down into the details of each excerpt trying to make it perfect, but we sometimes forget to zoom back out and see the broader picture, and I think that's really important. I instruct my students all the time to play along with recordings, At this point, like Spotify or whatever, what do we have? There's so much possibility with what you can do. I mean, choose your orchestra, you can probably play along with them, And so I encourage that because I think it's important that people gain an understanding of context of what they're doing. Without context, it's meaningless. So
I remember, speaking of playing for, in a way, to connect with non-bass players like violinists or violists or whatever. I remember, and this might have been Robin Kesselman talking about, but he might have mentioned this too. But like a comment that I heard from other instructors, like, all right, yeah, sounds good. I can't hear any of the pitches of those notes, like there's like low off the string kind of stuff, on the A and the E string, and it's like, oh, I guess that's true. It's really fun in a bass jack sort of way to like pound these super short notes, but maybe I should make sure that there's pitch.
Absolutely.
And you've listened to a whole bunch of auditions and mock auditions, taking students through auditions, and I'd love if it's okay, can we take a couple of the standard excerpts and like when you're back there behind the screen, like where do those go off the rails sometimes? And maybe they're different for different people, but can we, let's just take like Beethoven. I was doing this with Orrin O'Brien a little bit recently, and it was really interesting. So if you don't mind, like Beethoven 5 Scherzo Trio. Yeah. Where are some possible derailments in there that you hear?
As far as the scherzo goes, sometimes there's a lack of consistency in that rhythm of the half note with the quarter note after, just the simple ba da 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 da. Oftentimes that gets sort of rushed through and doesn't maintain its consistency. The other thing I've found, at least, and this is a bit maybe personal taste, is there's some pretty distinct characters in that particular passage. You have the opening, which is very smooth, legato. I actually write in my part because I put little buzzwords in my excerpt books to sort of get me centered, to get me sort of like one little word phrase that maybe gets me to think about, like, it's not that I want to be thinking about, okay, here I'm going to play legato and here I'm going to play fast, or what kind of dynamic. It's like if I think ribbon for Beethoven 5 Scherzo,
so like, it's not technical. It's metaphorical.
Metaphorical.
Hey, okay, wow,
metaphorical
very cool.
word.
Yeah.
And I'll actually sort of take little sticky notes and post those in. Whatever feels like it just gets me right into that zone. That's what I do. And so that's what I'm thinking of for that opening line. Is just this long ribbon-like sound, but making sure, of course, that the rhythm stays, very secure. And then after that, sometimes what we have is, that sort of like march, kind of heavy march feel that comes in after the horns come in, tends to have, like, usually we hear a variance in the articulation there that's not quite what is printed. And so that's a couple places I can think of in the scherzo. The big thing for me in the trio, I think, is maintaining, this is something I got from Ed a lot, is sort of being reminded of how every one of the upbeats on the third beat should feel like an upbeat. And if we get sort of mired in the rhythmical, obsessive rhythmical pulse, we sort of lose the dance feel for it, And to me, those are the details that will separate and weed out your prelim advancers from the finalists. Because as soon as we start to hear the bum 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 bum, that feel of going into the downbeat, all the other stuff will always be there, And so I think it's a transition in your mind of, after you've done the hard work, thinking more about the big picture, And so that's actually what I think helped me further my career with these auditions later in life, one of the things I had was a group once I was in the Fort Worth Symphony. We can come back to another excerpt, but a group I had in the Fort Worth Symphony, which consisted of David Cooper, Dmitry Kustanovich, and Ed Stefan. David is now the new principal horn of the Berlin Philharmonic, and he was in Fort Worth with me. And Ed Stefan is now the new timpanist in San Francisco and was formerly in Pittsburgh. And Dmitry is a local buddy of mine that I still have to play viola. And so we would get together and we would play for each other. And these are playing for other instrumentalists entirely. And this was my audition club. We called it Cake Club because Ed's wife was making these incredible cakes for special events or whatever on the side. And she would give us the scraps. And we wanted a cover for for a club of people just trying to audition for other orchestras. So we called it Cake Club. And
it's a good to have that.
And, you know, I've moved on to Dallas, David's moved on to Dallas, and now Berlin, and Ed has moved on to Pittsburgh. So we were preparing things every week, every couple of weeks, just to play. Even if we didn't have an audition, we would just play for each other. And that was a real necessity, being that we were young professionals and needing other people to play for, to hold our feet to the fire, you know. That and the occasional lesson going down to play for Paul and Tim, because they're so close and just always have wonderful things to add. Really, I think, you know, when you get a job early and you don't know that it's the end of the line for you, it can be hard to find a set of ears in some ways to kind of keep you motivated and going.
It's like in business terms, people talk about having a mastermind, you know, a mastermind that you meet every week or every couple of weeks to like go through and brainstorm. It's kind of like your musical mastermind,
exactly,
made of people not playing bass too,
right,
which is very cool. You like across instruments, and how cool to be having a timpanist, a great timpanist, or like other instrumentalists, you know, like listening in on that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've listened to a Dallas bass audition since you're the most recent one, but...
Yeah, we had one fairly recently, and that was the first one.
Okay, well, like, if we take that, or even the sublist audition for Fort Worth or whatever, I'm assuming Beethoven 5 was probably on that, since that's on everything.
Sure,
what are some of those other excerpts that are, you know, that you would have on that are kind of like gatekeeper excerpts? Like with Beethoven 5, what's another one? And then, like, what are you looking for in terms of...
Yeah, I think another one, like Brahms is one of those that falls into an interesting hole, because, you know, people have some pretty specific ideas about how they play Brahms, and that tends to vary pretty widely, you know. And so oftentimes it kind of goes back to that thing of like, I actually want to hear a difference between your Beethoven stroke and your Brahms stroke on the separate notes, you know. And I, you know, Ed used to talk about it, and I still abide by this sort of more leveled out, longer, heavy brush stroke, you know, on a lot of the separate for Brahms. You know, I have a rule that I like to give. You know, I have this sort of timeline. You know, if you take the major big four, Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, and Strauss, and you sort of go across those and sort of map out what the stroke should look like, you've got basically this V-shaped pattern for the off-the-string stroke in Mozart, where there's very little contact with the string, and it's more out in the middle of the bow. And then you can work your way in towards the frog, and then it becomes more U-shaped. Well, when you get to Brahms, that U really, really flattens out. And to me, that between Beethoven and Brahms is where we kind of cross the horizon line. And all of a sudden, the stroke becomes more on than off.
Okay.
And so conceptually, I try to show my students that all of a sudden, look, the bow's mostly on, and we're going to lift the ends of the bow off. And then when you get to Strauss, for me, it's virtually on the string and sort of a stopping the string stroke with those really fast eighth notes.
Let's talk about those strokes for a second.
Sure.
How the heck do people develop that kind of stroke palette? And I know, I mean, like Ira's doing his bowing workshop.
Yeah.
People talk again and again how critical the bow is, and just having that variety of strokes. Like, how do you have students develop that, or what do you recommend in terms of technique exercises? Or
I mean, there's a lot of ways that a lot of books out there. You know, Hal Robinson has his Stroke In book, which really is nice for breaking down the physicality of each stroke. But yeah, I mean, basically we apply that to like different passages. Like I'll even have them work on this stuff just in little chunks from the excerpt itself. You know, my students at SMU are coming in with almost very little knowledge about orchestra playing, so I feel like it's pretty like rudimentary what we're doing early on at SMU. But But these kinds of things can be done simply with like those. I think the Zimmerman book is great, and that's a string crossing book. But certainly with almost anything, your scales, the Galamian scale book, you can work on these kinds of things just all throughout. It's pretty simple to apply this stuff as long as you have a clear understanding of what those strokes should look like and where they should be done. I think it's pretty easy to figure out, how you can do that.
Brahms and trying to get that kind of stroke, that kind of almost lifted stroke at the ends of, right? So it's more on than off. We've crossed that horizon, like you said. So that's something you're listening for in Brahms.
Right.
Like Brahms 1, Brahms 2, whatever you happen to ask. Anything else that knocks people out of the running, knocks them off the rails for Brahms?
This. Not so much. I would say that's one of the main things in Brahms. Of course, being able to also sustain the notes we're asked for, showing directional line through a long note.
How do you do that?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
It almost boils down to how do you crescendo towards the tip?
Yeah.
That kind of that kind of thing. Being able to really have the bow mastered so that the up bows and down bows aren't dictating your phrasing. Music goes beyond our bowings, and I work with the students on that a lot at BUTI. It's actually quite fascinating, especially with the music of Brahms. And someday I'm going to write this stuff down because I feel like every summer I want to write an article for the ISB Journal on this, and I feel like I could call it "Looking at Brahms Through My Brahms-Colored Glasses" because it's like you have to slip on these special glasses because Brahms on the page doesn't give you nearly as much information as what is there, and there's a way that music must be played. It's very specific in terms of its style, but that style is not spoon-fed to you like it is like in Mahler, where he's very clear about every single thing that he wants you to do. And so I find every summer that I'm, kids see a part for Brahms 3 and they're like, oh, this will be the easy part of the summer because we just did Mahler 6 last week.
Right.
I'll never forget that. I was looking forward to cruising through that too after the big heavy lift of Mahler 6, which they did beautifully. This was a couple summers ago. We got to Brahms 3 and it was like teaching how to play the bass all over again, because there just was the way the music breathes, the way that there has to be the accountability for space between the notes, and not just cutting a note off, but cutting a note off with the right hand while keeping the left hand going. This is a concept, the independence of the left and right hands in Brahms is a concept that particularly younger players haven't developed yet. And so that's a really tough thing to play. If you take the opening bar of letter E from the first movement of the first symphony, a very common excerpt, E flat, G flat, E flat. Those first three notes have three different articulations if you look closely. Short eighth note on the first note, eighth rest, quarter note, eighth note without a dot, followed by a quarter note. Getting that to come out, is something that, now I'm not going to be one to say that I would immediately pick that out in a bass audition, but just being able to play that way and apply it to the rest of the things, I think is very, very important, and sometimes people don't think about that. And I find that teaching that is a very tough skill, and the young ones tend to not know how to do that yet. So Brahms is particularly tough, especially with the independence of the left and right hand. When it comes to other audition repertoire, I should say too, it was surprising to me in this past audition how similar Mozart strokes sounded to me to Beethoven or Brahms, that the off-the-string stroke simply wasn't as short, especially in our hall. I mean, I have to say that as a caveat because we have a very wet, resonant hall. But I think people, at least to my ears this time around, didn't tend to play those notes, the off-the-string Mozart spiccato, quite as short as they could have. And it should have quite a bit of, I would say, resonance buoyancy behind it, but the articulation itself could be a lot more off the string. And I prefer to play it actually, a little further out in the bow. The fortes that we play in Mozart don't need to be forte in the real volume sense. They need to be forte in terms of clarity.
Okay, that's a great way to think of it. Yeah.
So I think of when I hear something, when I see forte on the page, I think of, making this absolutely clear like a bell tone, and that's going to be what carries to the back of the hall, which is, what we're looking for, especially if you're talking about differences that'll carry to the back of the hall, sort of going back to what we were saying before, and this idea of diction. So to me, that's what I'm always trying to instill in the students, or those that I coach.
So we bring up Mozart too, and let's just take Mozart. We could take whatever, Mozart 35, Mozart 40, Mozart 40. Okay, I'm getting ready. We're working on the excerpt from the first movement of Mozart 40. What approach do you recommend people take to develop to prepare when they're not ready to play that thing at tempo,
right?
But they need to be working on the stroke. Like, how do you get somebody who maybe hasn't had experience playing something like Mozart? How do you get them to start practicing something like Mozart 40?
Yeah, it's a good question, and that it's one that comes up often. And I'm working on that right now with some of my students who haven't had exposure to it, so it works out well. But to me, that excerpt, that passage, again, it's one that you can really divide into two parts. There's the melodic portion, which has its own set of issues, right? And then there's the stroke part that we're often listening for. And the challenge there is that even though you can establish what would be, the main stroke, you're moving all over the bass. You're cutting the string in half. So that's not going to feel the same as it does down here. So that presents its own challenges. So usually what I go to is I go right to the heart of the matter with the A's at the end and just developing some sense of how the stroke is supposed to sound. So I'd have people start there, right? And you can also use this as an opportunity to mix in some of the Zimmerman book, the bowing book, because then you can break things down into simply like two strings and right in the middle of the book, right? Or in the middle of the bass, I should say. And so that's obviously a good place to start. Then once we get into their ability to manage the bow and how to get the bow to bounce the right way, we start maybe getting into, well, how do you move around on the bass? So what I like to do there is I like to have them play it in sort of syncopated rhythms. So dum, ba-dum, 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 this kind of thing. And you can reverse the rhythms. This is something that I got from Jeff Bradetich. He likes to break down things this way. And then another thing that I picked up with Ed Barker, as far as getting the left and right hands to be in sync, is moving accents around. So especially in the classical repertoire, whether it be Mozart 35 or whatever, it really works beautifully the way those notes are beamed in groups of four, to take each one of those four groupings of eighth notes and put an accent on the first one and work your way through, then move that accent to the third one and work your way through that way, and then put an accent on the fourth one. And then the hardest is to put it on the second one and make that happen. So but by the time you've done that and moved that through a particular tempo, maybe it's 60, whatever. By the time you come back to, you've done your rhythms, you've done your accents. When you come back to just playing it straight, it's vastly more easy. And that's our goal. That's our goal is to sort of challenge ourselves to push that box further and further out, so that the stuff that we're actually called to do back sort of in the core feels more natural. Yeah. And it's not it's not a skill that's foreign. There's this book, The Talent Code, Dan Coyle, that talks about where things are learned sort of at the edges. How the pilots are challenged and things are learned sort of at the edge of where they are. And so what we're doing is we're trying to push that edge, that cerebral edge that we have, out further. Ed always likened it to a ball of clay. Like if our brains are a ball of clay, maybe he talked about this, and you're etching these grooves and these channels. And so by doing this kind of work where we're actually working beyond what is actually being called upon us to do, challenging ourselves, trying to jump at 9 feet even though we're only supposed to jump at 8.5, that's when the 8.5 feels much better. And Jeff would do this all the time too. It's like, why are we practicing 2 octave shifts? I don't know of a single piece of music I've played where that's been required. But 1 octave sure feels a heck of a lot easier. And so that's why we do it. And this is the same kind of thing. You're not going to be asked to place these accents there, but man, by the time you come back to this passage just written as it is, it feels so much better and feels so much easier. And that's the other thing. A big thing I have to instill in my students is, so much of us want to get in a room, set that metronome on, and just work with the tempo. And to me, the tempo is the icing on the cake. And I tell my students all the time, in the summer times too, it's like, I've painted a few rooms now, having owned a couple houses. And to me, I can't escape that analogy. It's like, what do you do when you paint a room? Well, you go through the tedious work of masking off everything. Like you put stuff down on the floor, you tape off all the board, all that little hard work. The biggest change that you actually sense and feel is when you throw the paint up on the wall. But that's actually the easy part. Yeah. And to me, that's the tempo. All the other stuff is the details, all the detail work. Am I articulating this the right way? Am I doing the phrasing that I'm being asked to do? We worked on a lot of stuff. I worked on a lot of stuff with Ed in slow motion. He likes to slow things down. Everything's very calculated. And it's only then, once you actually get the body mechanics working to do and express what you're trying to express, that then, boom, then the tempo goes up. And as soon as the tempo starts to be able to move in a positive direction towards where you want it to be, that's when it will really start to feel rewarding. But we have to be patient. Yeah. We have to be patient with that, because if we're just ingraining bad problems, the tempo is not going to make a hill of beans difference,
Well, I think that's such an important point to hone in on. I love how you put it, the icing on the cake, because I think that's what people start. That's the most obvious thing, right? So that's the metronome. You're just clicking up, and you're ignoring all of you're trying to short circuit the process, right. And the myelination, right. from the talent code, developing it. You need to let that develop, and I think it was Andy Rossiti, yeah. And I don't know if this came from Paul Ellison or not, but he was talking about how the brain doesn't really remember speed as much as you think. It's more, you can solve things in slow motion, and then that's where the real learning and problem solving takes place. And the tempo is much less of a concern than you think. You hear right. Someone playing this fast stroke, and you think like, "Wow, I want to do that." Well, it's like the way is not the way. It's right. Very kind of like meta way to look at it.
Well, and the tempo also is something that I although the metronome is indeed important and grasping rhythm, a good concept of pulse, inner pulse, is extraordinarily important. I would say that oftentimes it sort of hides other problems that we maybe fear to address. And so, that's where you want to go at the end once you've addressed all the other problems. So I encourage people to, at least my students, to think mostly about what is the real problem here. If you brought in a beautifully executed Mozart 40 at quarter note equals 60, we could really get somewhere. I mean, that's really great. So, but oftentimes that doesn't happen, and so that opens the door for us to work on various techniques, and so it's a good way to do that. And
how do you know a beautifully executed Mozart 40 at 60 would be a great thing, but right. So frequently it's not. There could be intonation problems, there could be shifting problems, some underlying tensions that are right. Just inhibiting the process. What do you recommend students do, or people just working on things do in general, to diagnose those problems? Because we spend so much of our life sitting in a room by ourselves. Right. Obviously you have the Cake Club is a
right.
great thing, or studio class if you should be so lucky, but regardless, you're still spending a lot of time in a room by yourself. Right. Like, what do you recommend people do to figure out what the heck to work on?
Yeah, you're talking about like professionals or anybody really. Playing for people is a huge component of that. It's also just, people talk about this all the time. It's really important to record yourself. I mean, if you're not playing for a teacher on a regular basis while you're in school, you really have, teachers have this duty to, I think, instill a way for you to help teach yourself, and I think that's really important. I remember Robin saying something about getting that from David Moore. He had really good ideas about how to do that, and I think people have to learn to do that. And recording yourself is certainly part of that. As far as once you're out of school, certainly getting comments from others and hearing what is not coming across in auditions is a good way to do that too. But we have to become our best. Our best teachers ourselves, especially once we're out of school and don't have that sort of weekly held to the fire kind of thing,
The last part of this conversation revolves around motivation. And I'm so struck by the fact that Brian was in the Fort Worth Symphony. Great job. And it was in, I believe, for 9 seasons before getting the Dallas Symphony job. And so many people associate winning an audition, any type of audition, but especially a 52-week season, major orchestra like the Dallas Symphony, they associate a position like that maybe with someone right out of school, right out of grad school, maybe out of Curtis or out of Rice or North Texas or wherever. But how do you keep moving forward and staying inspired as you've got that daily grind going? And we should all be so lucky to have a grind like the Fort Worth Symphony, right? It's a great job. But how do you keep moving forward as a musician where so many people don't? That's what we dig into here. Super fascinating conversation, and I know you're going to dig it.
You know, kind of zooming out for a second, like it's so cool to see what you're up to in the bass world. And relatively recently, you got this position, the Dallas Symphony, right within the last three or four years.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and you were in Fort Worth for a while, 9 years,
Yeah.
and taking auditions, you know, for various things. I'm sure, and you seem so inspired and motivated, and you're active, you know, with the Bradetich Foundation. You're on the board for the ISB. What is it that keeps you inspired? I mean, so many people I know get stuck, and people should be so lucky to be stuck in a job like Fort Worth. That's not a bad thing at all, but like, you've continued to evolve and try new things. What motivates you to keep moving forward with your bass playing, your craft, your art?
You know, I think teaching has been a really important component of that, particularly with the work that I do at the Tanglewood Institute in the summer. You know, it's just a really refreshing thing to be able to work among students who are really working hard to try to become better bass players all the time. And plus, being up in that environment and soaking that all in the summertime is really rejuvenating for me. It sort of reminds me of what this is all about. When I'm there, I almost feel like I'm that kid in high school again that's just excited to hear all of this great playing and all of this artistry. But even the students themselves, you know, this year was a really great year. We always have a great section of bass players up there, and Ira teaches the first couple weeks, and then I come in and take over. And one of the things that just came out of these sections being who they are as these really talented high school kids was that it worked out that all of them happened to have some form of some movement of the first Bach cello suite learned.
Really?
And so while Ira was there, he sort of seized upon that, and he did a Bach class for them, and they worked on that. And some of them who didn't even have something entirely learned were inspired to keep going. And so what I said to them was, guys, we need to do something with this. This is a pretty unique situation that everybody's got one part of this learned. So what we ended up doing was we ended up gathering them, and we performed the entire Bach first suite. One person would take maybe one half of one of the movements, and we had them all lined up in the cafeteria. We invited their colleagues down for ice cream so that we would have like at least a bit of a demand for an audience. And it proved to be one of the most inspiring things in my 6 or 7 years doing there. I was really actually touched by it, that these kids, that they wanted to do this, that they were willing to do it, and that they were excited to share this with their friends. And it ended up being a really great educational experience for them, I think, too. And the beauty of it was that we started it from the start to the finish, and so it would just bounce around in the arc, whoever was playing. You didn't quite know where it was coming from next, and it was a really cool thing. And especially on the repeated sections, you would hear the personalities come out of each of the students. And so, Bach is this ever-living thing that, is such beautiful music and great for expressiveness and personality. But to me, that was one of those things that was really inspiring reminder of what I do. And, it's easy to sort of get stuck in the hamster wheel of the orchestra preparation from week to week and the grind, I guess they call it. So students and teaching and being involved with the goings-on of the ISB and seeing what other people are doing, going to these conventions that we have every year, going to this competition like we had last week, it's a reminder of just kind of where the bass is going and how far we've come in the past 20, 30 years. And it's a reminder that we have so much more to do with our instruments than what is apparent to us on a day-to-day basis that really keeps me going. As long as I have that getting on the phone and talking with Ira, I'm almost inspired every time I do that, because he's such a thinker, and he's always thinking about how to do this or how to do that, or how do we go about teaching this concept. And so, when I have those little sort of guideposts throughout the year, little conversations here and there, it really gets the juices flowing, gets me out of that sort of grind.
Yeah, yeah, recharging the batteries just like that. And I had the same experience with Ira. Like, I feel like I want to go practice Bach for 3 hours when I get the phone with him.
Exactly.
Well, I got one more, and we this is the first of hopefully many of these conversations, because we could just barely scratch the surface of things we could talk about. But if you look on paper, one would see your career path as the smoothest thing possible, and of course, in reality, that's never the case. But look at Brian. Went to North Texas, went to Boston, got a job, got another job, teaching at Tanglewood, all these things. But if you could go back and talk to 17-year-old Brian, 18-year-old Brian, something like that, from the experience you've had now, what advice would you give him?
Yeah, I would. It kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. Find the best teacher you can at the best school you can, but really surround yourself with other people that are as inspired and motivated as you are. Because I think that's as important. For me, early on, before I left high school, that was being around other, in the youth orchestra, being around other kids who were taking things seriously. That could be a group class or something that you may want to pursue that way. As I moved through school, it was going to festivals. It was being around other enthusiastic bass players. I auditioned for every festival I could just to try to be around other people who were as enthusiastic as I was. Going to conventions, being around that, making sure that when you do select a teacher, again, that there are going to be other people there with you, studying with that teacher that are equally motivated, which is usually not an issue, but that kind of thing, it's a very important part of the environment, because there are trials and tribulations, as we all know. There's heartache. There always is. I was very fortunate to have the early audition success with Fort Worth, but I took a lot of auditions between Fort Worth and Dallas, and you have to be willing to sort of pick yourself back up and understand that things happen, and you got to learn from those experiences. I think my audition for Fort Worth was night and day different than my audition for Dallas in terms of what I learned in between that, and the experience that I've gained from the job of just actually, I wanted to find a way. We talked about the grind and the hamster wheel of that, but I wanted to find a way to harness the experience that comes with that, And what I told myself, what I found out was, as I was doing more and more auditions, was that if I could remind myself that I belong in this process and didn't get down about so I'm not trying to move over from some much bigger job, or because I'm not that kid straight out of Curtis that's just ready to go, or whatever it is. I wanted to remind myself that I have all of these experiences. I've played Don Juan a bunch now, so if that's being called upon, I know this, And so that was a very important part of my future audition success, was reminding myself of that and figuring out a way to harness that energy, combined with what else I had going on with the Cake Club and playing for people and figuring out what do I need to do to convince others that I know what I'm doing, not just myself. So it's a lot of those things combined. But I think again, getting back to your question about what can people do, I think it's just really important to have good peers around you as well. And so however someone can go about doing that, I think is a great thing.
Hey, pleasure.
Yeah,
so
pleasure,
great to
likewise.
chat.
Brian, it was so great to chat with you. So much fun to hang out and get to know you in Dallas. The day before we recorded this, and by the way, this was recorded at a great coffee shop, Ascension Coffee, I think is the name, in the Design District in Dallas. Very cool part of town. If you haven't been to downtown Dallas and explore, there's a lot to see there. It's really an exciting part of the city, and it's a really cool town. Near that is the Arts District, where the beautiful Meyerson Symphony Center is located. And what a difference it makes having a hall like that to play in. I was just in awe of the sound of that orchestra and this chocolatey sound of the bass section. There's just such a cool experience. And that's one of 3 world-class halls in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Fort Worth has this gorgeous hall, I believe a bass hall, not bass hall, but bass hall with these trumpets coming out of the wall. And then the University of North Texas has this fantastic hall. The Murchison Center, I think is the name of it. Wow, how cool to have 3 world-class facilities like that right there in the same town or the same area. And I'm just having such a good time traveling around the country and doing some international travel and chatting with people. I just feel so lucky to have the time to do that. And that's something that I didn't even think about or maybe took for granted back when I was freelancing before. And then I got a full-time job and I got 25 other part-time jobs and my time evaporated. And now that I've moved out to San Francisco, I just through force of moving to San Francisco, my plate got cleaned, right? And as I'm building up a new career, a new set of opportunities and activities, I'm trying to keep as flexible as I can so that I can go and chat with people like Brian and take in events like the Bradetich competition that we were both at. So inspiring. More content from my week in Texas and the Bradetich competition, 2017 Bradetich competition, coming up soon. And it's so great to have you along on this journey. If this is your first episode, hey, welcome. You got 400 that you could rewind and listen to, but don't listen to the first 100, believe me. I'm so thrilled to have you here. ContrabassConversations.com is our website where you can get all sorts of information about the show, go through past guests, sort by topic, all that kind of stuff. And I would love to hear from you. Feedback at ContrabassConversations.com is our email. Send me a message and you can send me, hey, you can just give me a shout out. Hey, love the show. That warms my heart and puts a smile on my face. If you have an idea for a guest or a topic, I love hearing about those. And since you've listened this far, I'm assuming you're into the show, so I will yak at you for another minute or so. What happens when you email me a topic? Well, here's what I do. I, most of the time, will then take that topic and put that out in our Facebook community group. Yes, we have a Facebook group for the podcast. If you go to ContrabassConversations.com/community, that will take you there. And I put out ideas for shows. So somebody emailed me and said, boy, I'd love to know more about posture. So I put out something about that. People responded. I realized, oh yeah, that's something people want to hear about. One came in recently about how the heck do people afford their bass? And I have my own personal answer, and I know that everybody's got their own sort of spin on that. And so I put that out, and we got 40 or 50 comments right off the bat. So I know that's a good show idea. So then I take those comments, drop them into Evernote, start fleshing out the idea for a show. That's how it works. I take what you give in terms of ideas for guests or topics, and I try to bring that to you, and especially when it's something that I see a lot of people are interested in. So thanks for checking this out. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for following along. And we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.